Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. So I'm Hannah Lester and I'm the CEO of KIND Consulting, and we are a regulatory affairs consulting company based in Barcelona. And we specialise in alternative proteins and novel food regulations in the EU and other global markets. So today I want to talk to you about regulatory planning for alternative proteins, specifically thinking about where to go first, when to go there, and how to get there. So in today's talk, I'll be focusing on three important regulatory jurisdictions. So I'll be speaking about the EU, the US, and of course Singapore. I'd love to cover more regions, but I only have 20 minutes today. So I'm going to briefly cover the regulatory frameworks in the EU, the US and Singapore. I'll be discussing where to start first, and then also to discuss regulatory approval timings and tie it all together into a regulatory strategy. So as you all know, alternative protein research and development, investment and potential in general is growing exponentially. And you may have an idea for an alternative protein, or you may already have a product, but it's important to ask the following questions. So is the product viable from a regulatory point of view, and will it be safe to enter the food chain, and will it pass regulatory approval? How do you get the product to market, and where do you even start? What data do you need, and which studies do you need to perform? And are all the same data required in all of the countries that you're interested in? Which market is the easiest to get regulatory approval in, and where do you go first? So I hope to clear up some of these questions for you today. So what is a novel food? So it's important to note that not all countries and regions use the term novel food. So in the EU, they have a novel food regulation and a novel food framework. And in the EU, their definition of a novel food is any food that has not been consumed in the EU prior to the 15th of May 1997. Where in Singapore, they also have a relatively new novel food regulation, and their definition is any food that doesn't have a history of 20 years worth of safe use. Interestingly, in the USA, there's no novel food regulation, but if you have a food or a food ingredient that was consumed prior to 1958, then this can qualify as generally recognized as safe by common use in food. So starting off with the EU, the definition of a novel food is any food ingredient or manufacturing process that has not been consumed or used in the EU prior to the 15th of May 1997. So novel foods can be traditional foods. So a traditional food is a food or an ingredient that has been consumed outside of the EU in a third country and has a history of safe use. And traditional foods are typically whole foods that have been minimally processed and that are from primary production. So examples would be seaweeds, nuts and seeds, for example. Then for the truly novel foods, we have 10 categories, and these three categories are the most relevant for alternative proteins. So they can be foods consisting of, isolated from or produced from microorganisms, fungi or algae. So these would be your fermentation-derived products. Foods consisting of, isolated from or produced from plants and their parts. So these would be your plant-based products, plant protein isolates, for example. Or food consisting of, isolated from or produced from cell culture, tissue culture, derived from animals, plants, microorganisms, fungi or algae. So these can be your cell-based meats. It's also important to note that food enzymes, food additives, colours, flavourings, extraction solvents and GMO food are not within the scope of the novel food regulation, and they're all covered by their own regulatory framework. So I wanted to present a simplified overview of the novel food approval process in the EU. So of course, first of all, you need to generate all the data, but once you have all your data ready, you need to prepare and submit your novel food dossier to the European Commission and EFSA. EFSA then validates the dossier and performs their scientific evaluation. They then publish their scientific opinion, which is reviewed by the European Commission and the EU member states. And if they are convinced that the product is safe, then they will grant authorization. So a realistic timeline from the submission of your dossier until you can sell the product on the market is around 1.5 to 3 years. So it's certainly not a quick process. So what are the data requirements in the EU? So first of all, you need to check Regulation 2017-2469 and the relevant EFSA guidance documents. But in summary, you will need to provide information on the identity of the novel protein, details on the production process or manufacturing process. So you need to provide information on all steps of the manufacturing process, so from the very start to the very end, and also detail any reagents or culture media that you're using in the whole manufacturing process. You need to present data on the composition of the product, and also need to provide purity data and also stability data. You need to provide specifications for the product. If there's a history of safe use, you can also present that. You need to say what the proposed use is and the use levels, and also to specify the food matrices or the food categories that you'll be using the product in, so whether or not it's going to go into protein shakes or whether or not it's going to be added to baked goods, for example. So you also need to provide data on the ADME, so that's the absorption, distribution, metabolism and excretion of the protein. You need to provide nutritional information such as the protein content and amino acid profile, and then you need to provide the safety data package, which can be comprised of toxicological data, and you also need to address any potential allergenicity issues. It's also worth mentioning that in the EU you can request data protection. So when you submit your dossier, you can request data protection for proprietary data that you've generated. So proprietary data would be your toxicology studies, for example. And what happens with data protection is if it's granted, you are granted the data protection for a period of 5 years, which means no other applicant can benefit from the data that you have generated for that period of time. So it basically means no one can piggyback onto your authorization, and it doesn't mean that they can't sell the same product, but they would have to submit their own dossier with their own data if they wanted to sell the same product. So it's worth knowing about data protection. And then the EU, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that we need a more transparent food chain. And since the 27th of March this year, there's been a new EU regulation on transparency that applies to all regulated products in the food chain, including novel foods. So this new regulation has really shaken things up, but there are several things that you really need to be aware of. So the first being that all studies that you're going to be performing to support your novel food dossier must be notified to EFSA before the study start date. So this is really, really important, because if you don't do this, then when your dossier is submitted, it's automatically given a 6-month penalty. So EFSA will not look at your dossier for a period of 6 months, and your dossier is put on the EFSA naughty pile. So it's really important to notify your studies before they start. Then to do this, applicants must sign up to EFSA's online portal and register for an account. And you can obtain the pre-application ID here, and then you can do all your notification of studies. Then it's important to know that you need to produce a confidential and non-confidential version of your dossier, and that the non-confidential version will be made publicly available. So in terms of the data that you can claim as confidential, so that will be any personal data. You can claim the manufacturing process as confidential, any industrial specifications, and the quantitative composition of your product. But any data pertaining to safety will not be granted confidentiality. It's also worth mentioning the EU's stance on genetically modified organisms. The EU is not particularly GM friendly, but you can use genetically modified microorganisms for the production of food as long as there's no recombinant DNA in the final product. So I think that's really worth knowing, particularly for precision fermentation. So in April of this year, the European Commission issued a statement saying that they were going to review a lot of the new genomic techniques because of the advances in this particular area. So we may see that more genomic techniques will be accepted in the EU eventually, so watch this space. So here I just wanted to give you an overview of the regulatory status of some novel proteins in the EU, and I've split them into plants and algae and fermentation derived products. I haven't included cell-based because there are no applications at the moment. So as you can see, there's quite a nice number of plant protein isolates and powders, but unfortunately the majority of them are still going through the whole EFSA evaluation process, and most of them are clock stopped. So a clock stop means that EFSA has gone back to the applicant and requested either further data or clarification on existing data. So when the clock is stopped, that means EFSA is no longer evaluating your dossier, and they won't look at it again until you've answered the clock stop, basically. So you'll also see there are not that many fermentation products that have been submitted to EFSA, and none of them have gone through the whole evaluation process yet. So moving on to the USA, there are several regulatory frameworks or regulatory pathways in the US, but today I'm just going to focus on generally recognized as safe, or the GRAS route. So for the GRAS route, you need scientific data or a history of safe use to support the safety of your product. Any scientific data used to support your GRAS file needs to be publicly available and has to be published. Also, the GRAS is specific to a particular intended use, and you also need to convene GRAS, an expert panel, basically, to assess the safety of your product. It's important to note that notification to the FDA is optional, so you can either have a self-affirmed GRAS, so you're just basically saying that your product is safe, or you can notify to the FDA. We would recommend notification to the FDA. Also, we would recommend engaging with the FDA before you sort of put your GRAS dossier together, because they are very open to discussing the content of the GRAS file, and also discussing which safety studies would be required. And also the FDA is very open to considering substantial equivalence. Also, on the plus side, they're more open to genetic engineering as well. So in terms of data requirements for a GRAS file, first of all, check the FDA administrative GRAS toxicology and genetic engineering guidance documents, as they're very, very useful. But the data requirements are very similar to the EU. So you have to provide the identity of the novel protein, the production process, intended use, dietary exposure, use levels. If there's a history of common use prior to 1958, and then the typical safety and allergenicity package. Also, a lot of the data that you generate either for an EU dossier or a GRAS file can be recycled. So that's good to know. So in terms of the approval process for a GRAS file, you need to prepare your GRAS notice. It's then reviewed by an expert panel, and they write their safety conclusion. It's then notified to the FDA. As I've already mentioned, this step is optional. And then if it is sent to the FDA, what you want to receive is an FDA no questions letter. So if the FDA is happy that the product is safe, they will issue a no questions letter, and that means you're free to place the product on the market. So a realistic timeline from the submission of the GRAS file to getting your no questions letter is 1 to 1.5 years, but the timelines are being stretched a bit at the moment. So here's a summary or an overview of the GRAS status of some novel proteins in the US. So in the US, they are way ahead of the EU in terms of approved novel proteins. And the good news is the majority of them have received no questions letters. We also see some precision fermentation products here, such as the soluble egg white protein and of course the soy leg hemoglobin derived by fermentation. So this is really exciting. Moving on to Singapore. So their novel framework was launched very recently, so launched in 2019, and it draws on elements from other legislation, including the EU. So the novel framework at the moment is relatively modest and could be subject to change as it evolves. So in Singapore, the definition of a novel food is a food or ingredient that has not been consumed as an ongoing part of the human diet in a significant proportion of people for the last 20 years. Also, the data requirements are similar to the EU, and it's important to note that safety assessments that have been performed or data sets from the EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and USA are deemed relevant by the Singapore Food Agency. So in terms of timelines, you're looking at 3 to 6 months, but these timelines may be longer in reality. So I think the SFA approach, in my opinion, is really, really good. And I think regulators in other countries have a lot to learn from the Lion City. I think the reason, or several reasons why the approach by the SFA is so positive is that they're really happy to discuss the data requirements for your novel food dossier and discuss study design. All data are treated as confidential and there's no transparency regulation. As we all know, they've already approved the first cell-based chicken. They're also really flexible on labelling and have actually thought labelling through. So you can use the term meat as long as there's an appropriate qualifier. So cultured meat is absolutely fine. You also have the option to submit data piecemeal. So when the data become available, you can submit rather than submitting one dossier. And they're just really open and flexible and encourage applicants to engage with them, which is really great. And I would say the only downside is that the SFA approach is not adopted elsewhere. So I'm fast running out of time. So just in this table, I've summarized sort of the key parameters for the 3 different regions. The slides will be available after after the conference has ended, so I'm not going to sort of explain this anymore. But moving on to the strategic considerations and where to go first, so there's some important points to consider. So self-GRAS is probably the easiest route, but it's important to note that it's not accepted by some customers, particularly the big multinationals that have a very low appetite for risk. Singapore is probably the quickest in terms of evaluation timelines, but the data requirements are very similar to the EU and US, and you still need to generate the data. The good thing is you can submit the data to the SFA as the data become available, or you can submit when your EU or GRAS dossier is complete. You have to remember that for your GRAS file, the safety data must be published, and unfortunately this has implications for your EU dossier and data protection. So if you have your safety studies published before you submit your EU dossier, then that invalidates your claim for data protection. So that needs to be considered. Also, you need to remember that for the EU, all studies must be notified to EFSA before the studies start. So pulling everything together, what is a possible regulatory strategy? So in the first instance, you should always start by identifying which data you need and which studies you need to perform. I would recommend to base the study requirements and the data requirements on the EU because it is the toughest, but to make sure that any study design is compliant for all of the regions that you're interested in. I'd definitely encourage applicants to have the pre-submission meetings with the FDA and SFA. With EFSA, they are limited in the advice that they can give, so that's why I've sort of put it as an optional thing. Remember that then you need to notify your studies if you're even if you're not thinking about the EU immediately, you have to remember to notify the studies even if your plans for the EU are 5 years down the line. So you really need to start thinking about the EU from the very beginning. Then you need to conduct your studies, and you can submit the studies and the data to the SFA as they become available. So the SFA registration process would run in parallel. Then compile and submit your EU dossier and request data protection. Then you publish your safety studies, and once they're published, you can prepare your GRAS file and convene your expert panel. Then you would notify your GRAS to the FDA, manage all of the post-submission phase, and then all being well, and if all the stars align, you get all of your products approved at a similar time. So that's how it could go. That's one possible regulatory strategy. So you'll be pleased to know that I'm now pretty much done, and I'll leave you with some take-home messages. So the EU has a very complex and inflexible regulatory framework, but it does offer very good data protection. The US GRAS is a good option, but be careful with self-GRAS and the timings of publishing data. The Singapore SFA is very open and flexible, and data and studies can be submitted piecemeal. EU approval gives access to a huge market and is recognised globally, so it can act as a springboard to registration in other countries, but you have to remember to notify your studies. And finally, there's no easy way to market, but regulatory planning and getting your regulatory strategy right from the beginning will certainly help. So thank you all very much for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.